I'm June Reith.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time we are interviewing two folks who made a really challenging and wonderful game called Half Earth Socialism. We're interviewing Francis Tseng and Pham, who were the developers of this game. You can go play it at play.half.earth. It's a web-based game, so load it up on your phone and maybe get it going in the background of this episode.
Oh yeah, great idea.
Mm-hmm. Work through those inevitable early failures while we interview them about the design. It's a hell of a game, right? And it's the concept is that baffling as it might sound, in the year 2022, there's a global socialist revolution, and you play as the lead planner for the next 80 years. It's 60 years, the tenure. Yeah, it's 2082 that the end date is. Yeah, and you're making all these decisions about how to tweak production, do research, implement policies to get climate change under control. And yeah, it's real fun.
Yeah, and your planning bureau has the very cute name of Goss Plant.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love the humor and I always love a good title or a good name for something. And a lot of these like planning cards have wonderful little names. I do love the one that's just it's like crackdown on cryptocurrency, which saves 1% of electricity, which I think is quite fabulous.
Oh, yes. It's just like, oh yes, just the pleasure of being able to just press a button and be like, bye.
Yeah, that's the one I do immediately.
Yeah.
It's quite an amusing game.
Yeah, there's actually something I completely forgot to ask them about, but hopefully we'll be able to talk to the book authors about, which is just the what do you call them? The demographic groups,
the political groups,
the sort of pops, the political groups that are in the game, and how those were selected, because they're very interesting, right? Because it's like there aren't any capitalists in the political decision making process, right? It's like when we talked about in the Revolutionary Strategy podcast, the Mike McNair podcast I did of Tom, about how, like, yeah, when you have a revolution, like the new revolutionary bloc may be diverse because the successful party splits when it gets into power, but it doesn't include necessarily the pre-revolutionary power bloc.
Yeah, they're like monarchists. They just become irrelevant.
Exactly, yes.
The capitalists have been vanquished at the beginning of the game, which I think is wonderful. And like it's even the play of the game really does drive home that all of this shit would only be possible under socialism, right? Because like so much of the measures you have to take to get emissions and global temperature and like species die off under control are all they're all things that are just totally fucking incompatible with markets and with like the value form and wage relations and stuff like that. Like this, like they really do need to have the establishing thing at the start where it's like, okay, 2022 global socialist revolution. Now that slate's fucking cleared, we can get on with this thing. Yeah.
Because it's like, for example, you look at like capitalist agribusiness. Whether you're doing the factory farming or you're doing the organic large-scale agriculture, the sort of two forms that are roughly compatible with capitalism, either way, you're basically consigning the planet's ecosystem to death. And the options that would work are ones that are sort of outside the possibility space of capitalism, because they just work in a direction opposite that of capital concentration and cash crop production.
Yeah, there was something. Yeah, again, I forgot to bring it up in the interview, but I was kind of struck by how I don't know how to phrase this. It's like you might initially go for some kind of what you might think are fairly obvious kind of maneuvers to try to get things under control, but they rarely really work out, and the game does guide you towards these other kinds of things. But what's interesting is that like the solutions that actually work are fairly nuts and bolts. Actually, like they're quite simple solutions, even if they're not totally intuitive initially. In that, like, yeah, dialing down industrial agriculture in favor of more labor intensive forms of agriculture, which we did discuss in the interview. And then you have later policies like the kind of, what is it, like the Ren Fair utopia sort of thing, where you're kind of permanently reducing production in favor of contentedness and like radically reducing pressure on the biosphere.
Yeah, the sort of like Beerian eudaimonia, like utopia, right?
So in some cases, when you're playing, you kind of go from what seems like simple and straightforward solutions that don't actually work to discovering solutions that seem to work that are in themselves actually quite straightforward, and like you can then reason about the like what's behind that. And it's like, yeah, it's I think it's a really great educational artifact for that reason, that it kind of guides you towards realizations in that way.
Yeah, and it's not entirely prescriptive either, because like even though I did go for that sort of more labor intensive approach on my playthrough, at the end there of the game, I was working on full automation. So I guess just because we had such an enormous surplus of energy from all of our solar power, using the highly efficient solar panels, it was like, well, we've got this energy surplus. Let's plow it into automation. Let's let's do communism, right? Like instead of consigning a large portion of the population to a life that may be fulfilling, but is nonetheless clearly a part of a division of labor between those who think or work with their hands versus those who work with their heads. So it's very cool.
And so, like, my more successful runs had that kind of theme where it seemed like once we were over the hump, you could start pouring points into that sort of stuff, into the like Ren Fair utopia. There's a card that's like abolish the distinction between town and country. And all that good stuff.
Oh my god, it felt so good. It felt so good to do. It was just like, it's like, I don't know. There's just something in my heart that's like, like doing these sort of like core programmatic points of like the Marxian political program and like making them real. It just, I don't know. It just feels like, finally I'm doing Carl proud, like these sort of like, social scientific observations about the way things need to go in order to like promote like the liberation of life, but just have been sitting on the in the filing cabinet for decades and decades and decades, and finally being able to do those things, it's hugely rewarding, or even sort of like implementing like a worldwide feminist educational curriculum, right? Like it's like, at a time like this when there's so much backpedaling on feminism, it's hugely liberating. And even like I just finished listening to the audiobook of Ministry for the Future, and even at the end of that scenario, one of the reflections of like one of the main planner characters is like, we still really haven't addressed the patriarchal domination dimension of society in any kind of adequate way. After doing all of this planning and all of this effort, we're still left with fucking patriarchy. So just being able to do, something grand about that is really, I don't know, it just makes me feel very good, very relieved, very liberated.
It does. Yeah, and especially when in the game, it's all these things slot together, like the project of decarbonizing the economy and restoring the biosphere, and like the feminist curriculum and all these other things are all hand in glove with each other.
Yeah, that's something that's like actually supported by social science, right? Is like, you know, it's so obvious the ways in which like patriarchal or toxic masculinity is like an enormous roadblock to achieving any of these things, and like actually addressing that is not just like a nice to have but necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, because like you go from the feminist curriculum to masculinity detox to abolish cars. Those are that's the tech tree there. That's quite wonderful.
Yeah, I managed to finish the game without abolishing cars and without going entirely vegan. I managed to save cheese, so that was near dear to my heart as well. It's like, oh, we didn't ban cheese. Oh, thank God. We didn't ban yogurt.
Well, I found that like I could get a lot of the pressure on livestock down by like banning fishing and that kind of stuff, but I found I could rarely afford the contentedness hit from the vegan mandate.
I mean, I couldn't even. I was like, well, at least my first playthrough, I'm gonna try for vegetarianism because, I like vegan food, but I also like animal products, even if I've moved more away from eating meat. So it's I don't know. It's just a nice part of life.
Yeah, I guess there's still room for it in the game. Yeah. Well, I guess with that, so let's move on to the interview. Yeah, thanks for joining us. It's a real pleasure. I've really struggled with this game, but hey, we can talk about that a bit later. For the meantime, maybe introduce yourselves to the audience.
Sure, I can go first. My name is Pham. I'm a graphic designer and technologist focusing mainly on emergent forms for the web. I'm based in Berlin, Germany, and you can use the pronouns he and him to refer to me if you want. And I'm really glad to be here.
And my name is Francis Tseng. I am a researcher at the Jane Family Institute based in New York, where I do a lot of software development of models and simulations and that sort of thing. And for my pronouns he or they are both fine.
Yeah, wonderful. So, I guess I'm curious about like the origin of this project. Like, how did it all get started?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. So early last year, an art director from Verso reached out to Trust about working on a website for a new title coming out on Verso called Half Earth Socialism. Of course, the book that's now been published by Troy Vitese and Drew Pendergrass. So basically, they had in the book, actually, from quite an early stage, conceptualized this idea of a website that allows you to play with the mixture of land use and resource use and kind of move a few sliders around and essentially hit like a calculate button, and there would be a simple linear programming algorithm that would spit out kind of a result saying whether or not that particular mix is compatible with Half Earth Socialism and keeping the Earth as a habitable place on the whole. And so at Trust in Berlin, we actually thought about this a little bit, and we reached out to Francis, and we counter proposed to Troy and Drew to make a game where you could actually see these things happen over time, and you could have various inputs, see them affect a certain kind of simulation, and then you could kind of adjust as the simulation runs. So a little bit more of a complicated but maybe more rewarding type of experience than a simple calculator. So that's how the project came about. And yeah, we kind of did a lot of pre-production work before we even started building anything, with conversations with myself, Francis, Arthur Roing Bear from Trust, and the authors, and also Chiara Di Leone, who helped us convene a reading group as part of the pre-process of getting ready to build a game that is kind of addressing many of these more complicated ideas relating to ecology, climate modeling, cybernetics, and so on. And Francis, maybe you can speak a little bit more to this.
Yeah, so part of the book, a big part of it basically is about cybernetic planning, and the kind of original linear programming calculator is part of Troy and Drew's proposal, basically that there is some kind of model that everyone has access to so that they can actually cogently participate in this democratic planning process, which is a key part of their kind of vision of Half Earth Socialism. So that's kind of what the calculator is usually for. And then, we had proposed a game maybe being as like serving a similar function, but providing a richer experience, like having some narrative on top, so it's more engaging. And that's kind of the main departure point of the game.
Right. So maybe just, I guess we're putting the cart before the horse a bit here, but could you just describe briefly what the finished product looks like for our listeners?
Sure, yeah. So basically, the game is structured around these cards that you can play. So the main loop of the game is that roughly every 5 years, there is a planning session, and then you take on the role as kind of the lead planner for the world. And you have a number of cards to work with, and each of these cards represents a different policy or infrastructure project or research project. So things like mass electrification to, let's see, what's kind of the more exotic things? Like
nuclear fusion, space elevators.
Yeah, nuclear fusion. Yeah, you can mine fossil fuel. I guess they're not fossil fuels, but you can mine for hydrocarbons on, Titan. So we have like a pretty wide range of these projects. And so then you decide you have a certain amount of political capital that you can spend, and you spend that on deciding which projects get implemented. And that's pretty much the main loop of the game. And then you just try and make the world a better place, more or less.
Yeah, and like you're kind of counterbalancing these, because it's a very dynamic kind of simulation, and things go sideways in all kinds of crazy ways, right? Like you run out of political capital, or like happiness drops to zero, or emissions and temperature skyrocket, or there's plagues, or there's fires and all kinds of stuff. So it's a really edge of your seat sort of game, and has that lovely just one more turn kind of loop built into it, where I kept losing, I kept absolutely getting slaughtered, and like. Initially, I couldn't get past the first 2 rounds basically without everyone storming into the planning building and putting an end to us. But I kept every time I failed, I had to refresh and have another go. It's really good design, addictive stuff.
Yeah, I think that's maybe quite a realistic situation, because I noticed that the authors of the book mentioned Neurath as an inspiration for the book, and what actually happened to his planning efforts in Bavaria is pretty much 2 turns, and then the building gets stormed and you get kicked out, thrown in jail.
So is it like deliberately like XCOM, where it's impossible to win for the first 10 or 15 attempts?
Not well, it isn't impossible at the first 10 or 15 attempts, depending on how you approach it. But the the first two planning cycles are definitely some of the most difficult. Where if you can't stabilize at the beginning, then it will be very, very difficult for you to succeed later on in the game. Although XCOM was one of the influences on some of the earlier prototypes we had and some of the earlier ideas we had for the game, actually. We kind of, in the earlier stage of the design, we were kind of imagining being able to visit different parts of the planet and kind of dispatch like heat crews that could cool people down in their heat waves and so on. We ended up not kind of going in this direction because with the limited resources we had to produce the game, it was definitely more important to capture the global scale of Half Earth Socialism and the effects of climate change rather than kind of go into this regional view. But it was definitely something that I think both of us had played XCOM and we kind of really enjoyed the overworld view, you know, that you get when you try and manage an existential threat.
And it has that sense of there being quite a bit of stuff happening behind the scenes that's not evident to you as a planner. Like in XCOM, it's the whole like whoop 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 whoop. There's aliens somewhere sort of thing. And in playing this game, I got a strong sense that there's a lot of hidden variables that are being tracked that I had no access to, and I had no direct access to. But when I kept getting these like locust plagues, or whatever, I could intuit that there was something going wrong with the way I was doing the planning, and I had to switch tracks earlier in the next run to address that sort of stuff. So
yeah, it's interesting because there are a number of other variables that aren't really surfaced, and it can be a frustrating experience in a game when you don't have like enough visibility into the system. And that was one of the many kind of design challenges, is just figuring out like, well, how much do you show to the player? Like, how much of the complexity can we actually like communicate in a way that isn't overwhelming and that's actually actionable? How much of it has to be hidden?
Yeah, I think in even our very earliest discussions, we talked about the kind of the guard game, kind of the problematic way that things like SimCity or other similar kind of planning and simulation games operate with an assumption that the player is kind of this God's eye view character with kind of an omnipotent way to affect the world. And we definitely wanted to kind of challenge that and embody the player's perspective in the world. In this instance, being the lead planner for God's plant and using the game as the planning interface. So a certain amount of opacity is kind of part of the game design as well, is that you can't actually know all of the stuff in the beginning about how, say, regreening the desert is going to affect global temperature, where you might expect it to reduce temperature and for an entire new green area to kind of sequester carbon and so on. But actually, because deserts are actually quite good at reflecting sunlight, the temperature may actually go up. So definitely part of the opacity is to do with the complexity of the simulation, and part of it is also a conscious decision to put players in a position where they're not kind of a universal God's eye view player.
Yeah, that's a really interesting choice because, well, first of all, having just spent some time on the Alpha to Omega, our sister podcast, ranting about my frustrations with ideas of perfect information, I really appreciate that, like, you do include that sort of obscurity of the future in your model. But second of all, I think it's leads to an interesting gameplay dynamic where I kind of felt myself like after having done my first playthrough, I kind of didn't want to play it over again because I didn't want to play it with foreknowledge. Like, I would only play it again if I was going to take paths that I hadn't taken the first time, because I really like that, sort of groping your way through the planning process dimension of the game.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, a lot of people. Yeah, I was just going to say about replayability and trying different strategies. It was kind of interesting too, like during the whole play testing process. Like there's so many different paths you can take in the game, and we wanted to be thorough before we released the game and like try a lot of them just to make sure, they worked as intended and so on. But it was interesting because a lot of people only wanted to play like one particular style, and so it ended up being very hard to see like how the more like off-kilter strategies played out. So I think people now have kind of discovered maybe weirder ways to win and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's interesting because like I found initially that I don't know, I was probably just drawn to a certain set of cards and certain strategies, and then kind of noticed that like though these aren't working out, so I had to like then back out and reevaluate. And I would wager that that happens for everyone. It's just kind of like tickles whatever their particular biases are, and that the game is doing this kind of educational thing of like teaching you that like picking, starting with the first move with Stocknovite shock workers, accelerationism, and the consumerist curriculum will probably not work out. Right, like the game is steering you toward a realization. So, like for example, a lot of people would probably be drawn immediately towards like electrification and like biofuels or whatever, and maybe not realize that one of the keys to success is probably to actually reduce demand for electricity in the first place, and to that sort of thing, right? But that the game teaches you that through failure, and then you kind of learn to adjust your strategies.
Yeah, I guess initially in our design process, we were imagining the play sessions being a lot shorter, so that trial and error is really important, which I think it still is in the final game. But of course, the runs end up being a little bit longer. Like some people, will open up the game and just spend half an hour reading all of the card descriptions because there's so many of them. So I think the way that people open into the game and try things, from what I've seen, I think is really affected depending on whether they're familiar with some of these ideas or not. And I think a lot of the things in the game that sound good, and I guess like this reflects some of the real world technologies as well. Things that sound good on paper, but actually have a lot of difficulties in implementation. Whether it's like vertical farming, which has just a really insane energy use per unit of plant calories it provides, which is based on real world figures at the moment. Many of these things, it ends up being perhaps counterintuitive if you're not familiar with the details, but I think in a really interesting way, it kind of adds more shading and depth to these technologies that many of them have a real use, but it's not like we can just pivot our entire food economy into vertical farms, overnight. It just wouldn't. This is just not realistic. So I think in my playing of the game, I think the things that I enjoy a lot are being able to have quite a balanced mixture, especially when it comes to fuel, because fuel and energy sources, because it is so difficult, like in the real world, to actually divest out of fossil fuels because of the sheer amount of energy density that they provide. That renewables don't match. But I think you mentioned it just before, is that actually reducing demand is a really big part of this. And when you play the game, you realize that the best way to make your output more effective is actually to reduce the demand in the first place.
Yeah, I mean those are actually some of the examples that I kept coming back to when I was thinking about this, getting ready for the interview. That like I really struggled with fuels. And I think because in a couple of runs I would kind of just dial coal, petroleum, everything way down to zero, and then put it all into blue hydrogen or whatever. And then I would do things like research the algae-based biofuels, and then be kind of surprised by the result. It was like, hold on, how is this worse than petroleum? In a lot of the stats that matter. And I guess that's part of the learning loop, is that like you're kind of teaching people, no, actually a lot of these things are pretty grim, when they're actually implemented. Like, which I found really, there was a lot of really counterintuitive stuff I found in the game that I kind of, I don't know, when you're presented on the research screen with like, oh, research algae biofuels or whatever, it seems like a sure bet. It's like, oh yeah, sure, that sounds great. Like that'll save the planet. And then you actually get it in your hand and you're like, I don't know, this is actually kind of worse than petroleum in some ways or whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting where the game has to depart from like typical video game logic, like kind of maybe like what you're saying. In a typical video game, like every upgrade, every research thing is usually like strictly better than what you had before. But part of what we wanted the game to communicate is just like the tremendous amount of uncertainty in a lot of these decisions. So it's a bit of a risk to like, invest all your research points into something that may not actually pay off.
Yeah, like I feel like this idea that every option is an improvement is much more of a sort of like consumerist logic than it is a planning logic. And it's really interesting the way the game is sort of getting at those fundamental facts of planning. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of curious because like there's a lot of emergent detail in the play of the game, and there's kind of like narrative stuff, I guess you can kind of put in your head as a player. And I'm sort of thinking of stuff like, in a lot of my runs, I found that hydropower, its effectiveness dropped to 0. And I could kind of then imagine that might have been because there's just the water cycle is so disrupted that you can't rely on, water flowing in that way or whatever. But I'm kind of curious as to how much of this kind of stuff was deliberately designed versus it being an emergent property of the size of the simulation. Like the kind of extreme difficulties and the dynamism of the game, like how much of it is deliberately designed versus being just a kind of fact that falls out of the size of the problem.
Yeah, I think we wanted to make it so that as much as possible wasn't deliberately designed. I mean, that's still quite a lot of it is deliberately designed, but I think we knew, the book has a very kind of specific point of view and argument that it's trying to make, and we didn't want the game to be read as like kind of unfairly valorizing the ideas in the book, and we wanted to feel a bit more fair in its treatment of these other technologies. So wherever we could, we tried to, use values like parameters for like the amount of carbon emitted by algae biofuels or something like that. Tried to use like third-party research where we could. For a lot of these novel technologies, of course, there aren't really many numbers, and the numbers that do exist, there's a lot of uncertainty and controversy around them. But we tried to make like a relatively simple model of how all these things interconnect, and then just plug in, numbers that we sourced from more reliable places, and then just kind of see what happens. So a fair amount is kind of emergent, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, I guess like within the scope of the simulation, we tried to be fair, but we also wanted to model the risks associated with many of these technologies that maybe gets glossed over when we start entering heated debates about energy transition and so on. For instance, nuclear has a lot of risks modeled in as part of the simulation, which of course it does give the game a point of view, which is not a bad thing, but we didn't want it to be something that is overtly didactic in a way that a lot of these types of games often end up being, because it's not fun, and people are smarter than that. They know when things, when the rhetoric is too much, that it makes the argument less compelling, So, yeah, there's a really good talk I was listening to about how the extent at which you model the simulation kind of really represents the worldview of what you're building, and I think we're kind of not ashamed to admit that, but it definitely means that the approach that we had to how things are balanced is very different to how maybe you might design a more conventional game where things need to be kind of explicitly balanced in a certain way, or counter to that, if it's a very didactic experience, the bad things have to be very bad, and the good things have to be very good, and you're kind of like dragging players in a certain way to make them make their views align with your own. So to some extent we are modeling in an opinion into the simulation, but that's something that we're definitely okay with, and it's part of the challenge of adapting and kind of basing a game off a book which is a very strongly opinionated, utopian handbook of sorts to save the world from climate change and pandemics. So yeah, that was definitely part of the challenge in building the game.
Yeah, just to sort of give the players, or sorry, not the players, the listeners.
They are the players. They're the players of the show.
Just to give an example of this sort of like less didactic way the game works. Like by the time I finished my playthrough, I still hadn't eliminated fossil fuels from the energy mix that I was using. Like they were still in there. They were certainly a minority of the fuel that we were using, but it was a smaller amount. And the game kind of noted that in the conclusion, or the sort of concluding like ending scenes. But it didn't like, wag its finger at me about having failed to completely eliminate the great Satan oil.
Yeah. So Kyle, did you end up actually winning? Because I think I managed to finish, but not necessarily win a couple of times.
Yes, I did. I did succeed. I successfully saved the world on my first try. Which
what?
Wow.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Which I had two things that I think worked in my favor there. The first one was that I was very aggressive in the first planning period, not really knowing how the the political capital system works. So this political capital is essentially the points you can spend to do initiatives. And I kind of like broke the bank on my first turn. I was like, oh no, I'm going to lose, right? But, sometimes it's good when you're playing with a model to just like push to the extreme and see what happens. And I was saved by the hero of socialism. So this is a revolutionary hero who sort of was part of the revolution prior to the planning period starting, who kind of showed up in front of the World Congress and staked their reputation to save my administration. And what that meant is that I did this really huge investment in the first round, but then I managed to squeak out with enough political capital that I could survive until my project started to come to fruition, and then I would get political capital back for having them finished. So the hero of socialism saved me. It's not like told to the player that like this is you get this get out of jail free card that kind of helps a newbie get things off the ground, but it did save me. And then the second thing is that I am actually working at the Copernicus Institute for Sustainable Development at Utrecht University, and so I think I probably, given that I went and basically did a PhD in socialist planning, and now I'm doing a PhD in sustainable development and game design, probably like one of the best situated people to have the expertise to succeed at this game. And I think I had just read the findings of the IPCC 3 report before playing. So that gave me a lot of point form science that I could bring to my strategy.
Yeah, probably one of our most credentialed players then. You definitely. Yeah, I'd be very worried if you didn't win, actually.
Yeah.
That does seem like validation, right? That the model works, right? Like there's a congruence there that works. Now me, but on the other hand, I'm a fucking idiot, so I just shit the bed continuously for 10 or 15 rounds, and had no idea what to do. I eventually did half figure it out though. Like the game is quite good at steering your understanding towards strategies that are more likely to work, at least. I did find it to be pretty difficult though. But yeah, real good.
I was kind of wondering, like, you were mentioning that you based the kind of like balance of the game on third-party science. And I was just wondering, like, what kind of, as game designers and simulation builders, like what kind of expertise or institutional support did you have that allowed you to really access that science in a way that you could put it into your game design so that, like, the game could be didactic, but not in a beat you over the head kind of way?
Yeah, we had a really great research team that included the authors. So we had Lucy Chinan and Spencer Roberts, who were both very accomplished people in their own right, help us out in terms of researching all of these policies and futures and technologies and actually getting as accurate information about what the implementation would look like and how it would affect the model. And Francis, maybe you can also explain it a little bit.
Yeah, well, yeah. So we had a great team of researchers, and then Drew, one of the authors of the book, he's an atmospheric chemist, I believe. So he also just has like a tremendous wealth of knowledge and helped, check the numbers and make sure we're looking at the right places and what seemed plausible and what didn't. But yeah, a lot of it was just looking for different like national estimates on, how much how much petroleum electricity is produced and what the estimated emissions of that are and so on, and just deriving figures from that. Some of the more interesting things, like as I mentioned before, was looking at these more novel technologies. So vertical farming was very hard to find numbers on. I think I only maybe found 2 kind of random startups, like vertical farm startups that had published some numbers, and those varied pretty wildly as well.
Yeah, I was going to say,
so in those
like,
cases,
I sort of talked up my credentials, et cetera, but I am not one of the quant people in the institute, and I don't know these numbers off the top of my head. And actually, the vertical farming was one of the, or even the farming model in general was actually probably one of the most interesting parts of the game to me, because what the model suggests is, like, first, that vertical farming is maybe more of a kind of aesthetic. It has more aesthetic value than it has practical value, as sort of like, this kind of like fun techno utopian project. But also that, like, moving to organic farming is quite disastrous as a policy decision. And that actually we really need to shift to a lot of smallholder farming. So sort of peasant scale farming in order to make make our agricultural system viable and sort of shift to a more labor intensive energy mix, or I guess effort mix. So do you speak a little bit to the agricultural points there? Because, my father was a agriculture scientist, and I didn't know any of this.
Yeah, that was probably also one of the most interesting parts to me. And I think, again, this is like one of the big challenges of the game, is that, like, these numbers are so controversial, like organic, yield per acre for organic agriculture versus industrial agriculture. Like, you see a lot of papers with numbers in favor of organic and numbers in favor of industrial. And it's so context specific that it's really hard to make a general claim about one or the other. And that was really hard to represent in the game as we designed it, because if you're looking at the global scale, you lose a lot of that detail, which becomes really important. So, like, vertical farming, like, you're probably not going to feed, a substantial amount of the population on it, but perhaps there's some context in which it makes sense, like some regions where it's maybe the only way to produce food throughout all the seasons. Maybe it's not the most cost effective at a global scale, but perhaps, there are some places where it does make sense. So, unfortunately, we couldn't really explore those nuances. And so, yeah, agriculture, I think, is probably going to be one of the more controversial places within the game in terms of our numbers and stuff like that.
And just to sort of yeah, sorry. Just to sort of satisfy my curiosity, when you say organic farming in the game, are you sort of talking about like semi-industrial, large-scale organic farming, like the kind like where you would go to the supermarket and buy your quote-unquote certified organic produce that comes in a plastic bag from a large food corporation?
Yeah, I think that is basically what we had in mind. We had a third, or I guess fourth one originally too, for regenerative agriculture. I think we eventually just kind of ditched that because the numbers we had they were sort of indistinguishable from organic, or maybe like slightly worse in all respects. And we ended up breaking out some of those, like the practices that are associated with regenerative agriculture, like biochar, into separate projects. So I think like really the only kind of alternative to these more industrial scale forms of agriculture was the smallholder one. I think that was it.
Yeah, and I guess the idea there is that you're putting in more human effort as opposed to like sort of large scale chemistry, mechanization, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's more labor intensive, but it can conform better to like a local ecological context, and more like the kind of what's the term I'm looking for? The like abstraction that like mechanization provides that ends up damaging more of the fruits or something like that. Goes away a bit when you have people on the ground more meticulously handling things. Right, so you have like less waste or something like that. Yeah,
the farmers are actually like intelligent sensors of their local ecosystem, as opposed to just being like, okay, one size fits all, like just pave it over with plantations.
Yeah.
I noticed. I kind of noticed similar things like with. So I guess this stuff has to be. And again, this is my sort of curiosity about like how deliberate it is versus it just being a fact of the model. Because like, I can imagine a lot of players just kind of open the agriculture, like the plant and animal food based food agriculture panels, and just go, oh yeah, sure, just dial industrial down to 0, and then dial the fucking organic one up to 100, and it's easy solution. I guess that it then becomes very rapidly evident that that's not going to work. And so yeah, again, I was always wondering like to what it seems like that was like a fact of the model, and it's a fact of the model that seems to actually reflect reality. So it all kind of made sense in my head. But I also did get a kind of small sense of like this. The solutions can't be that easy, basically. And I don't know. Maybe is that a thing that's designed into it, where there's kind of obvious. There are some changes that might seem really obvious to players that don't really work out, and like. Or did you find that you needed to design that in, or did it just fall out of the model that this is just the way things are?
I think we tried not to have too many kind of gotcha scenarios where a player will try and take a route and it'll be like, oops, actually is really bad. But there are some things that are just self-evident in the way the model works, such as if you don't manage to reduce industrial livestock and industrial crops, then the chances of the global Dust Bowl event happening become a lot higher, which then actually reduces the output that you get from industrial agriculture in general. So we have these kind of they're kind of emergent, but they're also based on research about how these processes are actually very damaging for the environment in a whole lot of ways, with a whole lot of flow-on effects that we've tried to model in through these kind of events and through the supply and demand of energy and calories and water and so on.
Yeah, that makes sense, because it did always feel intuitively like it was going to be like it was like that. That it was. It always felt very difficult, but it felt realistic. So I guess that's a big success in the design that does come across.
Yeah, and just also to jump back to what we were talking about with agriculture, that reminds me too that like if I recall, the Global Dust Bowl event is much more likely if you have a substantial amount of industrial agriculture, and less likely if you have organic, if I'm remembering correctly. So it's also that like a lot of the times, you know, when you're in that process window comparing industrial to organic, you're just looking at like the per plant calorie impacts, but there may be kind of like off-screen effects that you'd also need to consider. So it's less straightforward than just comparing those numbers. Yeah.
That's very cool. Yeah, so I think one game that certainly comes to mind when playing this Half Earth Socialism game is, at least for the old heads like myself, is Fate of the World, which was a very old, or I guess quite old, similar kind of global planning game that was based on playing cards and interacting with a simulation that was put out kind of like with the collaboration of the UN and got some commercial releases. How much was Fate of the World an influence on your design? I was wondering.
I don't know if we ever discussed it as a group, but I looked at it very briefly, and my main takeaway was that it's like too detailed, because I remember there's like a lot of essentially spreadsheets that you're looking at. It's really impressive, the amount of detail in their model, but I think it was just too much for the average player, I guess, to like take in all at once.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing it in our like group chat, but it was already after we had decided on using cards and kind of the general idea of the game as well. So it was kind of funny to see this thing that looked quite, in a weird way, like similar in some mechanics to what we were doing.
Yeah.
And usually when I see stuff like that, I avoid it because I don't want to like subliminally trick myself into being influenced by it.
I know that instinct as a game designer. I really do.
It's a really strange thing. But yeah, I guess like my impression also of it is like you would do a workshop at like a NGO like meeting to like learn how to play this game, and then you would do it as the kind of one of these maybe like non-profit like edu role play kind of game experiences. It seems like definitely the type of edu game that we maybe didn't want to go down that path. Although there's another really interesting game from I think in the 90s, which was Balance of the Planet. And Francis, you found this one actually. It's a really really interesting like DOS era game about moving sliders around. And maybe you can explain a little bit better.
Yeah, I think, was it by Chris Crawford? Is that right? From the, I think 1990 or around then. And actually, if you look it up, it has like these nice kind of like Apple II era like 1-bit graphics.
Nice.
And it's really fun, but it is like much more of a like a literal calculator in a lot of ways, where like you're kind of playing with sliders, and it's actually kind of like the original idea of the Half Earth Socialism game. I imagine might have looked something like that, but it has like nice illustrations. It's actually a really neat game.
So I'm curious then, like, were there any other, like, how many like interaction models or how many like overall designs did you entertain before settling on the cards?
I think we settled on the cards pretty early on. Is that right?
Yeah. I think we, in our initial kind of pitch or in our initial vision for it, was that you would have the simulation layer running beneath, and then you would have some kind of card-based narrative layer on top where you would make decisions. And initially it was going to be, a little bit more simple in the terms of interactions you could make, where you would just kind of be saying yes, no, or maybe like yes, no, maybe, or have maybe 2 or 3 options to these events that would just continually appear in front of you. More similar to something like Reigns, which is a really fantastic mobile game. But we ended up steering away from that, but we kept the cards as a way to summarize a lot of these complex ideas in a very compact form. And when you're working with a mobile screen first, which is always kind of was part of our vision, is that cards happen to be a very convenient size for mobile screens, and kind of enabled the game to work at small screen sizes, which I think actually last time we checked, the just over half of the people playing the game are on small screens, so kind of paid off, I think.
Yeah, and I guess it also works with the aspect ratio of a phone, right? The card and the phone are both sort of card shaped in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's super interesting to me to hear about this kind of convergent evolution in design, because I think that when we look at design history, we have an enormous tendency towards primacy bias. Like the first instance we encounter of it, we assume that there's some kind of subterranean influence that comes down the line and affects everything afterwards. But I've seen this with a few games at least, where the designers are like, no, we literally did not play that other game, but we arrived at the same sort of design paradigm because of just convergent evolution. And yeah, that's a super interesting thing about design history, at least to me.
Yeah, even though we had settled on the idea of cards kind of being the main object or unit that players would be manipulating, we had like a bunch of different ideas within that too. Two that I liked that we ended up not pursuing was one would be kind of like if you've played any of the Diablo games, you know, you have like your character sheet or whatever, character inventory, and there's like a slot for your helmet and a slot for your, I don't know, your greaves or gauntlets or whatever. And so that would kind of be like your plan would have these specific slots for like an energy policy or a transport policy, and you'd kind of like equip your plan or equip the world with these different cards. And this actually, I think later on, Shunla showed me the Civilization 6 policy interface, and it's actually pretty similar to that, where you like,
yes,
you have a slot for economic policy and you drop something in there. And then the second idea that I liked was also like this more deck building approach, because something about like the way I was thinking about planning originally was that it kind of, you're equipping yourself with ways to respond to events in the future, which is sort of like how you build like a deck if you play Magic the Gathering or something like that. Like you anticipate certain scenarios and you try to design your deck so that you can respond to those if they happen. So we were thinking like, you know, okay, you're thinking out 10, 20 years, and you're thinking like, okay, there'll be a higher prevalence of wildfires, so you need to, build your deck with some kind of like rapid response firefighting policy or something like that. And then if that does happen, you'd be able to respond. But we ended up not going that route. I think it was too complicated. And
yeah, I guess in a sense, like the advantage that you have that would allow you to sort of avoid going down the route of a deck builder is that a deck builder is the player's set of options, but it's also it also tracks the deck tracks the game state, but your model is tracking the game state in a way higher resolution way than a deck would, and to I guess double up on that would create a lot of confusion.
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
That's a good point.
You can kind of see vestigial, I guess you can see vestigial traces of that in the little narrative popovers that you'd sometimes get, where one of the little characters will pop in and say, we really got to do something about, an event or something. And you can kind of click and dismiss them. But I can imagine a version of the game that has more like the world events and those character events are kind of a prompt for a response that you play out of the cards you've got or something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. I think in some of the earlier prototypes that Francis was working on was definitely like you would have a deck of cards and you play them in response to wildfires or droughts or so on. And I think, yeah, we kind of moved away from that. I think largely just because of the scope of the game needed to already be really huge and talk about things at a planetary scale, and that it was more than sufficient enough to kind of put in a project that says drought-resistant crops. And if you research this, you get like, a 20% reduced chance of crop failures. And then you never have to, actively play it after you've researched it, And I think it allowed us to kind of shorthand a lot of these things so that we could let the scope of the game be a bit bigger. But of course, we could kind of talk forever about like different ways the game could have gone just because of the subject matter, and we went through a lot of kind of paper iterations, not even getting into prototyping anything with code, about how you can model the planet, which is like obviously a very, very big possibility space. And obviously what we ended up with is obviously not a full model. It's incomplete in many ways, of course, but I think captures the key points that we wanted to communicate about land use, about limits, and about the necessity to reduce demand for many things, really.
Yeah, I was wanted to sort of move away from this quantitative, or I guess modeling discussion a little bit towards the more kind of like affective or emotional dimension of the game. We sort of, we talked earlier about how we all kind of come into the game with our own sort of notions of what will or will not be effective, or our own personal hobby horses, like, vertical farming maybe. But what kind of emotional reactions to the game did you see in playtesting, and how did that influence your design process? Because I think that, given that the game is to some extent a simulation, that may lead people to think that it's less interested in the emotional side of things. But it didn't seem to me that was the case.
Yeah, I think the utopian fiction element of the book is really not this doom and gloom kind of scenario. It's really a positive and kind of bright vision of how the world could look like, with nice details about the social lives of the people who live in that world, and how climate is as much a planetary meteorological and biodiversity challenges is like a basis for how we live in the world. So I guess in the game we really wanted to not go too dark. I think humor and levity and interesting things from history that kind of poke the head out from time to time in a really curious way. These all make the game kind of a richer world to kind of engage with. But of course, like, there's really no avoiding like some of the more kind of troubling and scary parts of climate change. There's really no way to avoid them without being disingenuous. So in the feedback, we got some quite good responses about enjoying the characters and their kind of silly, like 2D but kind of funny way that they behave and they talk, and also the impact of like when a species goes extinct and the characters really grieve for the loss of these cohabitants of our planet. We did find like that people were engaging with that, which is really credit to all of the people who were writing the dialogue and the events and making these things compelling, which I feel like maybe in quite a bright, visually quite bright game interface, that these events kind of hit with a little bit more impact just because of that contrast. So yeah, maybe Francis, you could also add something here.
Yeah, I mean, like you're saying, I think a lot of the tone of the game really drew from this speculative fiction chapter at the end of the book, that I think was added like maybe relatively late in the book's development, but just kind of using the game as an opportunity to show that not only are these sort of means of addressing climate change and the extinction crisis and so on, are they necessary just for kind of maintaining a reasonable level of planetary habitability, but also these changes present an opportunity to change our lives for the better in many other ways too. So we wanted to really kind of make it not that you're only addressing a crisis, but you're also actively building a better world.
Yeah, for myself, it was a very emotional process to play the game, which surprised me because I think in a lot of the discourse, the current discourse in the kind of like serious games, quote unquote, like, educational games, science education games, discourse that's going on right now, there's a kind of view that these, I wouldn't say God games because it's not quite a God game, but it is close to being one, right? It's one of those, you're in a situation of enormous authority and you make decisions about an abstract system. These kinds of games are often criticized because they're quite emotionally detached and they don't really situate you, and people feel like they're just sort of like toy models that people are playing with, and we need games that are more sort of ground level and connect with people emotionally in ways that are tangible. But that wasn't really my play experience of Half Earth Socialism at all. Actually, I found it, like you said, the extinction events hit really hard because that is like something that I think about all the time, pretty much every day. And yeah, just thinking about like, oh yeah, like this year, this thing actually happened. Like this species actually went extinct, right? But also the, I guess the possibility of actually doing some of these things that would make a better world, engaging in these kind of like utopian processes, was such an incredible, like, liberating feeling, even if it was just imaginary, because, we're constantly surrounded by this like inability to act every day in our lives, and just being like, oh yeah, no, like I can actually do things in the world that would make it a better place, would help these other species survive, would, improve the standard of living around the world, would help liberate women, et cetera, and just, even being able to exist in that imaginary space of possibility felt super liberating, and put me in this like, really different frame of mind. And then that same day was the day that the Guardian released their report on like these carbon bombs that are happening, where oil and gas companies are making these sort of covert investments in massive oil and gas exploration, at the same time that they are running greenwashing campaigns. And the Guardian was able to sort of figure out that they were doing this through some investigative journalism. And just that contrast of like, here's the hypothetical world where we are doing these, great socialist things to really address these historical injustices and work with our environment. And then here's the real world. And it was just an enormous emotional roller coaster of like feeling really high, wanting to cry, it much more emotional than I thought would ever be possible from a game like this.
Yeah, wow. I'm really pleased to hear that you had this impact. I guess in some ways, it is easier for us to make these things feel impactful just because of how close it is to reality. And I think ultimately, I would like to think the game is like a hopeful project, in that, yeah, I think our entire lives kind of spent within this very narrow way of understanding the world through capitalist realism. I'd like to think that the game and the book as well definitely are small cracks in being able to see other possible ways of structuring the world. possible, and I would say, yeah, necessary in order to avert a complete ecological collapse, you know?
Yeah, and I guess, June, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you had a different play experience for me. So how was it emotionally for you?
It was, yeah, so like I really couldn't get it under control for a good couple of rounds, and I was really floundering, but so there was a mild amount of frustration there, but a real drive to try again and keep getting it. In those kind of like early, quite dark runs, there was some things that hit me really hard that I found a bit surprising. Like the one that really hit me was the event where the forests are all infested with like ash borers or whatever, and all the trees are just being eaten by these crazy bugs or whatever. That one really kind of got me. I was like, oh, that's a bad situation. But then, in the couple of runs where I managed to actually turn it around and at least survive until the end, there was just some really nice dialogue, like pretty late in the game, where one of the characters pops in and says something along the lines of, hey, yeah, I mean, the last couple of decades have been pretty grim, but like, I don't know, maybe this is all actually kind of working out. We have actually built a pretty sweet society, you know? And yeah, as Kyle said, it was really nice to just inhabit that space for a while, which is very different from my usual day-to-day kind of like climate doom sort of mindset, where it seems nothing is possible. It was really lovely to be able to inhabit that world where, yeah, it's difficult. It's a really hard thing to turn around, but like that, it was actually possible to do it. And you know, that sense of hope that maybe that might actually all pay off. You know, it was pretty good. It was got me in the feels. You know.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah, great. So I guess, are there any other things you would like to add about your experience developing the game, or recommendations you'd like to make to people? Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, something that's come up recently is we're still kind of tweaking the game and adjusting the balancing and so on too. I think some people were struggling with the early rounds because of some balancing issues, funnily enough. And there's some numbers that people have disputed, so we're kind of rechecking them. So it's still kind of being actively worked on. Yeah. And I guess I would say if you had a hard time with it before, maybe give it another try, and hopefully we've adjusted some of these things to make it a little less punishing. Yeah.
Speaking of which, one thing I noticed is that the geothermal power has like a really limited scope that you can use, right? It's like, well, you can only use it in sort of geothermally active areas, so it's not going to be a huge part of your energy mix. But I guess here in Canada, there's some new technology being developed, and other countries as well, to create like geothermal boreholes in areas where it wasn't previously possible. So did you include that technology in the game, or did you consider including it, or was it just too speculative?
I think I saw, I don't know, I saw some article, maybe it was The Guardian, I can't remember, mentioning something along those lines, but it was pretty late into the game's development. I mean, that's the other thing that's been interesting, is that a lot of these things are changing pretty rapidly, and new techniques or new discoveries happen. And so I wouldn't be surprised if in a year or two, a lot of what we have is out of date.
Yeah, okay, that's so interesting, because I wanted to ask you about this issue of continuous versus discontinuous planning, because, you know, June and myself are both big fans of Stafford beer, and one of beer's strong arguments is that discontinuous planning, sort of 5-year planning, is kind of a non-starter. It's the world just changes too much to say, okay, 5 years from now, this is where we'll be, and not adjust it along the way. And I was kind of wondering, like, I mean, obviously it's really interesting to hear that even the game design doesn't work on a discontinuous basis, and you actually need to update to reflect the science or the state of the world. But how did you deal with this problem of, continuity in designing the game?
Do you mean
so did you consider not using a 5-year cycle? Like, I know there are sort of events that pop up in between the 5-year periods, which kind of reflect a bit of continuity. How did this go?
I'm trying to remember, did we ever really talk through, make a conscious decision around the 5-year plan structure? I feel like it was just kind of something that was part of the book, and we just ran with it.
I think in some of our prototypes, if we had fleshed them out for a longer time into more complete kind of mini games, we probably would have found that maybe the 5-year planning didn't work if we wanted to respond to events more frequently and have a more active regional role. But in the game as it stands, we definitely used it as a core structuring mechanic to build the game around this 5-year interval. So you can, obviously in the current game, you can mess around with your cards, set your production mix, set your research, and then click play, and then you see 5 years go past, and you can see the results of your plan. So it kind of gave us a nice period to work over where it's also, so it doesn't take, 3 hours to get to 2080. And so you can have these nice chunks.
Right.
But I suppose, being able to respond to things while you see the globe turning, we do have that actually built into the game, where you can actually make decisions as events happen as you watch the globe turn. But we ended up de-emphasizing that quite a lot in the final game.
Right. So I guess, it would be possible to maybe experiment with a kind of pausable real-time model where, time moves faster than real time, because obviously you couldn't get to the end of the game if it wasn't real time. But you could, pause to make decisions to sort of reflect that more short-term planning process. That might be a possibility. But the thing that would remind me of is I was just playing the other day Cultist Simulator. Yeah, it's a card-based management game that is in real time, and you can't pause the game. So when the system is spiraling out of control, you're in this very whack-a-mole high stress mode, and I think that might not really reflect the way planning happens, but it's certainly an interesting contrast to the way that Half Earth Socialism works in terms of both being card-based planning games but having different time models. Yeah, it's on mobile now, so I would absolutely recommend checking it out there or on PC, because it is a very interesting design.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of imagine a version of Half Earth Socialism that runs more in real time, and I guess it would have different affordances to what you decisions you're making moment to moment, just because of the difference in pace. I think for us, the periodic, even if, I guess, according to Stafford Beer, and I guess who am I to say differently, that periodic planning is not the best way of doing things. I think from a gameplay point of view, it really does allow us to let players come to terms with the multitude of options that they have in front of them, and then try and make sense of that before they start putting it into play. And I guess quite late on, actually, we changed some of the game's code, so it was very easy to reverse decisions you make in the planning phase, so that people didn't feel kind of afraid to put points into things and then realize, there's actually something else I want to try. And I guess some of the games that me and Francis are these very tight kind of readable, kind of perfect information games like Into the Breach, which is totally a different game to what we ended up making. But we enjoyed that in that game, you can kind of see a lot of the parts at play and kind of take your time to decide on how you want to act. And I think if we introduce kind of like a panic element of the time running down, it might create like a totally different experience, which I would also be interested in seeing what that would look like, you know.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And I mean, I certainly think that there is an argument to be made for kind of this discontinuous planning at this very highest level of abstraction. You know, maybe you'd want something more continuous if you were looking at the regional level or the local level, but I think it makes sense the way it's set up here. But yeah, just one of those, I guess it's just one of those fun legacies we get as socialists from good old Gosplan. All right. Well, yeah, I guess, June, do you have any final questions?
No, it's a really great game. I think it's a wonderful piece of, I guess it's a pedagogical artifact that I really encourage everyone to go check out. And yeah, thanks for coming on, and yeah, thanks for making the game.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And we're back. Yeah, what a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, so happy to have them on. I mean, it's, you know, everything they've done with this game, I think, is, you know, very near and dear to my heart in terms of my current research interests, like where I'm working, my, you know, everything we've done on GIU. Yeah, all really important stuff to me. So to see someone actually go out and design a game, like get to a, like, you know, 1.0 release, even if it is under continuous development, and have at least a fairly sizable number of players pick it up and give it a try is awesome, because it's so rare for a, like, educational game of this sort to find a larger audience. And I think it's a huge success that they managed to do that to maybe not the degree of a, you know, huge commercial game, but what would be considered, I think, an outstanding success for a educational or eco game without a commercial publisher.
Yeah, it's wild. It's weird how, like, in the pocket it is for us. It's like, I don't know. It's one of those things. It's like, oh, was this made for us? You know, it's really up our alley. And like, I remember during the Brain of the Firm reading group thing, that the concept of, like, using games for this kind of education stuff kept coming up.
Yeah, and it was just like, well, but we don't exactly have the expertise, we don't exactly have the time, we don't exactly have the institutional basis. And to see, I mean, again, it feels like when we read People's Republic of Walmart, it's like, you know, this is the book I would have written for my dissertation if I had been in a situation to finish my dissertation, right? And this game, I don't think I would have necessarily developed it exactly the same way, but there's so many points that it hits on from, like, our sort of agenda from the show that it's very, very gratifying, very exciting to play. I don't feel like jealousy about these things at all in terms of other people achieving them. I'm just so happy they exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, like, it's not like we were ever going to get around to that, you know, on our own time. Yeah, and I love them. I love this thing from a pedagogical standpoint, right? That, like, because, like, you can really grab people's attention with this kind of thing, and, like, you can get kind of people, you know, they'll probably do the first round and completely crash and burn in the first 5 years, and then be like, fucking damn it, like, try again. And then you come back and it's like Cookie Clicker or fucking one of those Farmville games or whatever. It's just like, it's got that kind of one more go sort of feeling. So, like, but as a way of teaching people about these concepts, like, it's tactile and becomes intuitive in a way that, like, you can't really get across to people in text as easily.
That's right. And yeah, like I know I said that I sort of did that one run and I was like, okay, that's my run. It wasn't perfect. You know, I didn't achieve everything I wanted to achieve. There were like big disasters that happened, et cetera, but I'm just going to leave it because going through blind and sort of pretending, role playing as the planner who doesn't know how everything's going to turn out was such like one of the parts of the game that I loved the most. But when I was playing, I was totally in that just one more turn mode. Like I was 100% like hyper focused, sucked in, and just like, yeah, sat there for an afternoon, mainlining the game, and enjoying every minute of it.
Fantastic. I think I finished it. I think I managed to get to the end maybe twice, but in both cases, I think I still had. Maybe the temperature was still too high, or emissions might have still been a smidge over what it needed to be, but the like biosphere die-off and contentedness and something else were within bounds. That it was doing pretty well on those grounds, but
so it's like you missed the target, but like it's like within the next planning cycle you might have hit the target, right? Like it's like you're on your way to getting things under control in the near future. So yeah, I mean that still seems like a success to me.
Yeah, and I also had a couple of runs where I got basically right up to the last planning cycle, and it seemed like it was going fine, and then suddenly it was like negative 5 million points or something. Like everything went wrong at once. I was like, no, what the fuck? And then you get the little bit where everyone's like, they storm the fucking palace and execute you or whatever.
Yeah. Did you use the geoengineering at all, like the atmospheric modification?
I think a couple of times I did, but not. I think I only used the initial like cloud brightening, which seems to knock a half a degree Celsius off, and it didn't seem like it had huge downsides, but I never pursued anything beyond that.
Yeah, that seemed very dangerous. The ones beyond that.
Well, like if you do solar radiation management, it like reduces the effectiveness of solar panels and that kind of shit as well. So I kind of intuited, like after a while, I started to work out that like you could get a lot of success by pursuing the kind of ecofeminist angle, do kind of like immediate projects for like biosphere restoration, like indigenous autonomy and a couple of other things along those lines. Try to switch to electricity as much as possible. I think the thing I continuously trip over is fuels, which seem to be really hard to get right. And I think I haven't quite cracked the agriculture bit yet.
Yeah, I think fuels were one of the most finicky things for me, where I was very much like, I think one thing I did, I'm not sure if this is actually useful or not, but I made sure that any changes I made to the fuel mix would be achievable within one planning period. So I would never like just sort of going off that Beerian idea of like making planning as continuous as possible. I never initiated a change to the energy plan that would take more than one period. So I could just keep my investments in line with my research outcomes as much as possible, and really try to just find the tweaks that would get me limping along the way until I could get better solar panels, and then just like boom, go all in on solar, as much solar investment as you can do within one planning period, and then the next one go all in again. Yeah,
that might be the difference, because I think I was less sensitive to, especially with the production changes, less sensitive to how long they would take. So maybe that's the trick. And I found pretty often I would end up with, for some reason, there's just like zero output from a whole bunch of things. So maybe that's why. Maybe I was just juking it too hard, you know?
Yeah, that's so... Yeah, I feel like the thing you want to do is like go long on research and policy and go short on energy mix. Like that's what you want to micromanage. And then to some degree, the agriculture is like in the middle, I guess, right? Like it's you don't have a ton of options there all the time, so you kind of bump it along.
Well, I found with the animal husbandry thing, there was almost no point in switching to organic. You just had to reduce demand as the way to get it down.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, like, oh yeah, that was really interesting to me, where it's like, people sort of in everyday conversations will be like, oh yeah, but like I buy like organic beef, etc., etc. It's like, yeah, but like that is better for the cattle. That is better for maybe the biodiversity of the farm where the cattle are being raised. But the energy and water consumption is out of control. It's like even worse than factory farming. So this game was like really good at spelling that out in tangible terms to me. And
because you look at the cards, right, and they've got the little barometers or whatever at the bottom for like energy intensity, water intensity, land intensity, and like biosphere pressure. And like those two cards are identical in those regard. They're all maximum red on both sides.
Yeah, it's like we just can't do this, folks. Like, yeah, like meat is got to be off the menu.
Like, did you get any mileage out of the cellular meat process?
Yeah, I definitely did invest in that, and I did move towards that as much as sort of was like viable with the amount of energy that I had available at any given time. Because it is obviously like a synthetic process, so it is more like energy intensive. But yeah, I definitely moved towards that. It sort of in line with my I don't know, I guess moderate extreme vegetarianism agenda.
Yeah. It's a real recurring theme. It's a theme throughout the game, and again, it's a theme in the game that actually reflects the reality of the situation, and that's why it's so good at teaching you this. That like you do start to internalize. It's like all of these good changes are all like super fucking heavy on energy, and so you like the electrification and like getting energy output way up and decarbonizing that energy production is one of those like critical pivot points for your playthrough.
100%. Yeah. Like it's, fossil fuels, especially oil and gas, the energy density you get out of them is so high, which makes them so portable. And the effort required to extract them has historically been ludicrously low and is now sort of, moderate, probably not that competitive with renewable energy if you took out the fossil fuel subsidies, right? But the energy density being so high is like, it's just something you can't really magic away through science. Like it's just, batteries just aren't as good at it. Hydrogen just is not as good as hydrocarbons at being energy dense. It's just physics and chemistry. You can't get around that.
Yeah. And I really struggled with the fuel mix stuff because like the even if you go all in on the green hydrogen and stuff, you still end up with huge shortages, and that's really hard to balance. So I think my next attempt, I'll just kind of leave petroleum in the mix for a bit longer and see if I can get around it somehow.
I left it until the end. I think the only thing I did was like get off coal as fast as possible, and then shift energy from oil to natural gas as much as I could to, sort of fuel the onboarding for hydrogen production and then wind and solar down the line?
Yeah. Coal is the first thing to go for whenever I start in Iran.
Oh yeah, I mean it's gotta go. It's gotta go. Like I didn't get rid of any nuclear, but I didn't build any either because I was like, well, I don't know if the game models it, but at this point in time in 2022, we're already past the viable window in which we could invest in nuclear energy in order to get meaningful outcomes out of it. So, like, you know, even if you put the pollution dimension aside, it simply isn't an option anymore. And so, yeah, I didn't invest in that at all. Tried to invest as much I could in geothermal, but the game is quite restrictive with how much you can get out of that. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe they'll change it in light of the new science. That would definitely make the game easier. It's like, you know, there's a lot of energy in the Earth's core that we could use too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's a thing I keep coming back to, but it's something I really admire the game for, that it can, as when you come to it first time, you can kind of try out your usual hobby horses of like, oh yeah, let's just jam up nuclear or whatever and flip over to the agriculture tab, you know, dial down industrial agriculture to 0, dial organic up to 100. You know, it seems like an easy win, right? Like, why is this shit so hard? You know, why is everyone making such a big deal out of this stuff? And then, of course, those are fucking disasters, right? Like, everyone dies in the first 10 years, basically. And then you have to kind of come around to these realizations that, like, shit, this stuff is a bit more difficult. And the trade-offs are a bit weirder than you might initially think when you're going into it.
Yeah, it's like there's this sort of double movement of, like, the solutions, you know, as you were saying, being kind of like more nuts and bolts than you might suggest or might expect in many ways. So in a sense, being much easier, but also there being that like high transition overhead, and then all of this requiring that you don't have the capitalist Thanatos lobby on board, sabotaging everything you try to do.
Well, that's the thing, right? Is that like the when you look at the where you end up in a good playthrough is often a lot of degrowth kind of stuff, right? Like you have the eco-feminist curriculum, you have like Ren Fair Utopia, and like dialing down meat consumption, and in some ways those are very easy answers. Actually, it's like, how do you solve meat production? You don't just don't fucking do it. How do you?
Yeah, just don't eat that much meat, or don't eat any meat. You know. How
do you solve pressure on the biosphere? Just do less shit. Just fucking hang around the house instead. You know, don't go anywhere or fucking, you know, make things. It's easy answers. But in our kind of capitalist realist mindset or whatever, or where we are now, and trying to push through that political barrier, those are the hard answers, right? Like that suggestion of like, how about we just do a whole lot less fucking stuff? And that'll take care of all kinds of pressure on the biosphere and energy demands and stuff. You know, how about instead of driving into town to go to work, I just hang out with my kids all day? That's actually the easy answer, but it's the hard answer in this world.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing like a sort of a Graberian bullshit job, the least climate impact you might be able to achieve is just by not working, maybe.
Just stop doing it. Like, I'm fairly convinced that we could actually just cut economic activity to a fifth and lose basically nothing. Because there's just such...
Yeah, as long as we had a way to manage the transition, yeah. And I mean, and we should say that, like, yes, there is a degrowth agenda here, but the other thing you see as you play through the game is just like all of these regions in the global south just like ticking up to high living standards. You know, just like literally billions and billions of humans achieving liberation from poverty at the same time that you're engaging in degrowth. And that is, it's really gratifying, but it's also really nice to see when the discourse around quote unquote development is so heavily biased towards like, well, the only success story has been communist China, which has just been like extremely heavy state planning combined with imitating the like, quote unquote best practices from capitalism to achieve a high growth. So kind of a from a sustainability standpoint, like basically a dead end. So to see those things not being an either or, but a both and is like, and you don't even have to kill off most of the animal species on Earth to do it. It's incredible.
Yeah, you can. It's great. It's when you get a good run and things start to go relatively well, it really does feel good. You can actually pass through the kind of, like you kind of get over the hill, and there's a couple of grim years, but yeah, once you're getting into the 2070s, if things are going well, it starts to feel pretty good.
Yeah, like all the rewilding successes that you see, like, like these huge swaths of the earth are like literally using that sort of half Earth concept, are just, they're just places for animals to do their thing. And that is, just a nice world to imagine, where, not like every narrative we have about the natural world is just about like precarity, disaster, guilt.
Bring back the mastodon, you get to do that de-extinction program.
Yeah, that's right. That's something that's in the end of Ministry for the Future. So I guess it's a popular notion to bring back the megafauna. It's like sort of like atoning for humanity's original sins of like, where we were doing like unsustainable development practices when all we had were like spears and furs. Like, oh, these big animals, they sure have a lot of calories and useful things. I guess we should just hunt them.
Yeah. And it takes a couple of million years for reason to transcend the kind of magpie brain of humanity.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if magpies are actually smarter. So.
They're probably less destructive, yeah.
From a sustainability standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. They're less inclined to fucking blow themselves up.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess this is an excellent illustration of the trials that lay ahead of us. As I said, I think it was really hard to read that carbon bomb article, which I strongly recommend people go read because, I'm not the biggest fan of The Guardian, given the way that they tend to affect politics, sort of act as the mouthpiece for the worst factions of the Labour Party and police left-wing politics. But honestly, that is some really outstanding investigative reporting that they did there. I'd highly recommend checking it out. And, one of the things that really stood out for me was that despite having such a small population, I think Canada is number 3 in terms of carbon bomb investment, like investing like in ways that are clearly beyond any kind of Paris commitments, and trying to cover it up. And, a lot of that has to do with economic exploitation of the Arctic, which, every capitalist in Canada has a massive hard-on for. And it really puts in stark terms, like, okay, Canada has a small population, so like each individual, like doesn't add up to that much. But when you take into account the impact that Canadian capitalism has, well, it's enormous. And it's like, this shit's got to change or we're all dead. It's that simple. And, this country is frankly, an existential threat to humanity on the same order, or perhaps more so than somewhere like North Korea. You know, it's a very, I mean, the U.S. same way, but the thing that like when it looks at the U.S., it's like, oh, the U.S. is the worst. It's like, okay, well, no one's surprised by that, but Canada, being as small as it is a bit of a surprise, and so that's where that kind of reporting really can help to light a fire under the asses of Canadians like myself. And you know, you combine that with sort of the images of utopia, the images of possibility, that the images of hope that you get from a game like this, and it gives you even more motivation, because it's like, well, you know, you only really feel the pain of despair when you have hope, right? And that's rough, but it does provide maybe a motivation in the way that the sort of like learned helplessness of reading the news every day doesn't.
Yeah, certainly, right. And you know, the game kicks off in the aftermath of the global socialist revolution, and yeah, again, yeah, playing it, you then turn around and it drills home to you that the ruling class are insane and they must be vanquished as a prerequisite for any of this stuff to go well. Yeah.
For like just literally anything to survive. Yeah, well, that's our agenda.
Yeah, let's get it done. These fuckers have to be brought low, and soon. Yeah, go play the game, folks. It's really good. Thanks, listeners. It's been wonderful as always. We hope you enjoyed the interview. While you wait for the next one, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook. We're on all the podcast apps. So subscribe, and I guess, yeah, also if you really like the show, share it around with your friends, because we could do with some more listeners and spreading the good word. Spreading the good word that the ruling class must be vanquished pretty fucking soon, by the end of the year ideally, and then we can get on with rebuilding the world.
Yeah, the sooner the better, really. Yeah.
Ideally by if we do it by the end of the year, we get to I don't know, maybe unlock a Steam achievement for doing that for the game.
Ooh, Achievos. So that's why the Soviet Union used so many medals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you get the Order of Lenin, and it pops up as a Steam achievement if you do the revolution. Anyway, where was I before that happened?
Getting spreading word of mouth, getting new people to listen, because we I think it's rough out there being a socialist right now, and I understand that we're not experiencing explosive growth at a time like this, because I mean, to be honest, we're on the political back foot. Pretty much everywhere. Even in Chile, the nationalization plan for the mining industry that they were trying to do under their sort of, I guess you could call it like revolutionary government, more or less, was defeated. And that was one of the bright spots for us. So I understand why people are not super eager to hop on board with a socialist podcast right now. But for those who may be interested, please share. And it's appreciated that we get more people to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully there's an upswing coming. Like, if you ever think, like, so this show has never been a Bernie Corbyn sort of thing, but it came up during those kind of years. And just like the different energy around that time, like the energy now is so fucking different, even though like we were never invested in those kind of projects. But like I don't know, the way the wind is blowing is very different now. And all we can do is ride it out and spread the good word, get people interested, get them thinking. I mean, it's what this game does, right? Gets you fucking thinking about these kinds of things. And if the day ever dawns, we'll be in a slightly better position.
That's right. I mean, literally, it's about improving the general intellect. So that is a positive. Even if we do need a System 5 to actually do these things that are in the game. Yes, that's right.
To help out with the potential emergence of Gosplant, much like one would help with the emergence of Skynet, you can go to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit and give us a couple of bucks a month to help keep the ship afloat. And you'll get access to our community Discord, which is a really nice place to hang out with some good folks. You should also check out Emancipation.network on the internet, because that's the podcast network that we're a part of. Check out our sister shows, such as From Alpha to Omega, Jumpsuit Utopia, Mortal Science, and Swampside Chats. They're all fantastic and well worth a listen.
And we have, after I believe, 10-month hiatus, we have restarted the Understanding Class reading group with From Alpha to Omega. So I think episodes are still coming out from our previous sessions, but can at least say that is ongoing and very spicy. If you want to hear me blow my top about neoclassical economics, go listen to that, because everybody was a bit surprised given the way I usually speak, but I guess that's the thing that makes me really upset, is when economics ignores the existence of time and space.
We've had, there's been some heated moments on this show whenever that kind of thing comes up, and it gets us both riled right the fuck up. Yeah.
It's one thing to have a 5-year plan. It's another thing to have a no-year plan.
To have just not a concept of time. Yeah. Yeah, that's brutal. That's a fantastic show, and I'm looking forward to hearing more of that. Anything else before we wrap up?
No, I think that's everything. So yeah, go enjoy the game. Maybe read the book. We might cover it on the show in the sort of medium-term future. May the socialist dawn come tomorrow.
Yeah, hopefully. Fingers crossed. While we wait for that, thanks for listening. We'll catch you again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.